My name is Ian Griffiths, and I am the Policy Director of Seamless Bay Area. Seamless Bay Area's mission is to transform the Bay Area's fragmented public transit into a world-class, unified, equitable, and widely used system by building a diverse movement for change and promoting policy reforms. Feel free as you come in, if you're just joining us, to take the poll that we have up. We'll leave that up for a minute or two longer and share the results so we can share who's in the room with us today. But I'm very pleased to welcome our special guest, Thomas Geier, Policy Advisor with European Metropolitan Transport Authorities, or EMTA. EMTA facilitates knowledge exchange between 34 European Metropolitan Transportation Authorities. Its members include some of the largest, highest ridership regions in Europe, including Paris, London, Stockholm, Vienna, Madrid, Barcelona, Budapest, and many others. And Thomas is seconded to EMTA from an agency called VOR in Austria, which is the public transit authority for the states of Vienna, Lower Austria, and Burgenland, where he is a strategy advisor for projects on digitalization and innovation in the Metropolitan Transport Services ecosystem. So we are very excited to have Thomas here today because he and EMTA really helps bring a comparative perspective to the issue of transit coordination that we have been grappling with, that we are grappling with currently in the Bay Area, and I think in many other regions across the US and North America. My hope is that he'll be able to provide us with an overview of how metropolitan transit is organized in a variety of different European regions, and some important lessons to consider as we seek to set up new structures and promote more efficient, better coordinated systems here, not only in the Bay Area, but throughout North America. The Bay Area is certainly a unique region, but many of our challenges around having many different transit operators, many jurisdictions, a variety of urban contexts ranging from dense urban cores to suburbs to rural areas. These are not unique conditions to the Bay Area. In fact, these same conditions exist in a variety of European regions as well. So before I turn it over to Thomas, we'll have the majority of the time during this webinar to further introduce EMTA and discuss the different models among its members. I'm actually going to present a few slides about the current context here in the Bay Area and why this is an important moment in time for us to be looking at different governance models. So after I present and then after Thomas presents, we should have at least 20 minutes for questions. So please submit your questions throughout the session as they come to you using the Q&A feature in Zoom. We'll try to, at the end of the session, get to as many as we can. And we are recording this session, so if you have registered, you'll receive a link to the recording, and we'll also be posting it later on our YouTube channel. So I'm going to end the poll, and now I'm going to share the result. Before we go any further, we'll just share the results. And I'm not sure what you're seeing. I'm assuming you're seeing the results here. I have my view, but so we have 60% roughly folks from the Bay Area, but also several people from outside of California, and several from Canada, and a few from Europe as well. I don't know how I go to the next poll question here. Oh, here we are. You know, in terms of where people are working, about a quarter of the folks in the room work for a public transit agency or authority. Few in consulting and nonprofits. A third or so don't work in the transportation sector. We've got a few students and retired folks in the room. And then, interestingly, what region do you think in the world has the most seamless, easy to use public transit? I don't know if I'm redirected to a link. This is my first time using this poll feature for Zoom. So I guess when I click on it, a window pops open, see lots of Switzerland responses, Central Europe, Munich, Europe, Madrid, Metro Vancouver, Sydney, Europe, Barcelona, Berlin, Asia, and Europe. So many of the same answers. So great. All right, with that, we'll transition over to my intro slides. see my screen. Okay, so I introduced Seamless Bay Area. We are a nonprofit group, and of course, public transportation is central to so many of the Bay Area's most pressing challenges. Here in the Bay Area in particular, we have a huge affordability problem and challenge, and access to public transit is so important to addressing our access to housing and transportation. Also, transportation is our largest source of emissions here in the Bay Area and across California. So shifting to public transit is essential for us to be able to meet our goals for climate change. And even prior to the pandemic, the Bay Area's transit system was not keeping up and was essentially stagnant in terms of ridership. The per capita ridership was declining prior to the pandemic, and speeds were decreasing on many services. Everyday users, frequently commented that the system, just doesn't work for too many different types of trips. It takes too long. It doesn't take people where they need to go. It's oftentimes confusing and not reliable. This was prior to the pandemic. Now, unfortunately, many of the challenges facing transit have been magnified due to the decline in ridership caused by the disruptions of the pandemic. And while Bay Area transit ridership is recovering, it is among the weakest recoveries in North America. Only about, as of August of this year, 61% of ridership had come back across our various agencies. And this is much lower than other regions in the US and much lower than many of the regions I think we're going to hear about in Europe. This has created a financial crisis for Bay Area transit agencies. You've probably heard the term fiscal cliff. Our region is forecasting $700 to $800 million annual shortfalls beginning in 2026, which is when the federal money that has been authorized, and then this past few months ago, state funds, additional state funds were authorized by the state legislature, but all of that money is only going to last us till about 2026. So our region is seeking to advance a ballot measure, which is how we raise taxes here in California. You have to go to the voters. So 2026 is the year that our region is seeking to ask voters to authorize more funding for public transit. And we really need to pass that measure to avoid massive service cuts to our region. But it's also an opportunity for us to be able to fund transit in a way and seek to bring about transformation of our system. It's an opportunity to rethink how we run and fund transit. One of the key issues that Seamless Bay Area has focused on as a barrier to having a more effective system, and this predates the pandemic, is our extremely fragmented network. We have 27 transit agencies in our region, and I think, as we'll hear about more from Thomas, this is actually not a very uncommon quantity of transit agencies. There's many regions in Europe that have even more authorities than that. However, they are very poorly coordinated. There's a lot of differences between the agencies from the user experience. Service schedules, fares are not coordinated. This creates barriers for riders, uncertainty, long trip times, and poor reliability for many different types of trips. And this has been a long-standing issue. Prior to the pandemic, only 5% of all trips taken in our region were done on public transit, in comparison to something like 70% done in automobiles. And that, as I had mentioned, was declining even prior to the pandemic. Our vision is a seamless, customer-focused regional network. That this is a map, our vision map. We believe our region should be aspiring and orienting itself towards a map like this, where all services are planned and run in an integrated way and presented to customers in the simplest, most convenient way possible. Strategically planned to actually work as one integrated system that provides competitive travel times for various types of trips. This requires, though, that transit agencies, if we continue to have many of them, that they work together to work in harmony to operate different parts of an integrated network. And that means that certain things need to be standardized at a regional scale. Service quality, fares, schedules, wayfinding, and other aspects of the customer experience really need to be done at a regional scale. we also need more service overall, more hours of buses and trains. We need a higher level of service to be able to attract more people, and we tend to spend not enough we actually don't put out enough hours of service to be able to attract large amounts of people. So part of the equation is more revenue and more funding, but similarly the delivery of a more integrated system that's easier to use for riders. So a policy reform that we have long advocated for, that is based on a research that we have done on many other regions, and this, I think this forum we have today is even more kind of just further case studies around how things are done in different places. But we know that transformation into a seamless system requires an effective regional transportation network manager entity. The term is different in different parts of the world. I think we're going to hear public transit authority is sort of the typical European term that is used in the EMTA network. But essentially, this is an entity that focuses on delivering outcomes to customers, that oversees certain key regional functions at the regional scale, not on an agency by agency scale. And those things typically include long-range planning, fare policy, developing service standards, the regional backbone network schedules, customer experience, branding, and in some cases, project delivery. So a few of the models that are on this page, several are in Europe, but also there's a few good ones in North America. In particular, Vancouver is a really notable model here in North America that's had a lot of success. We just want to share that there was some research that Mineta Transportation Institute that did on this topic that we were part of several years ago, looking at high ridership regions and how they were organized and what some of the common features were. And here you can see, and many of these are EMTA members, regions that were studied, and they identified what functions of the transit system were done at the regional scale in each of these regions. And they found that, remarkable similarity in that, what things were done at the regional scale in these high ridership regions, including planning, fare policy, coordinating schedules, procurement, monitoring of service standards. These are all associated with quite high ridership levels. When we compare the Bay Area on these same, which of these elements are done at the regional scale, we find almost none of these things are done at the regional scale in the Bay Area. And we also see the significantly lower transit ridership in our region. So our opportunity, again, looking forward, and the reason why this is a timely topic for us right now, is we have this opportunity for a once-in-a-generation pivot. With the opportunity of new funding comes the opportunity to introduce reforms. And that 2026 ballot measure that a lot of the entities in our region are orienting towards can come with the opportunity of putting in place the type of governance structure that we see in other parts of the world, and that I think EMTA brings a lot of experience in recommending how it be set up. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. I think this is my last slide, and turn it over to Thomas. Thank you, Thomas.
Well, thank you, Ian, for this introduction, and for already making the case for the PTA, or the network coordinator, as you frame it. Can you hear me well at this point? Yes, you can. Very good. So good evening from Vienna. Good afternoon to the West Coast and wherever you are. My name is Thomas Geier. I'm with EMTA, as Ian has introduced, and I'm very happy to just walk through a couple of the considerations on functions and also governance models that European transport authorities are employing. Let me share my screen with you, because it's easier with a bit of support. I guess you can see these slides now. Is that correct? Yes, okay, super. So, as I said, my name is Thomas Geier. I'm originally from Heidelberg in Germany, and I'm a policy advisor with the Metropolitan Transport Authorities Association, EMTA. We're officially based in Paris, but that is pretty much just a letterbox, because the French association law is the easiest in the European Union. So we have the easiest overhead cost structure when we're based in Paris. So our Paris member, Île-de-France Mobilité, has allowed us to have a small letterbox at the front of their door. I'm based in Vienna myself. I'm working with the VOR, which is the Integrated Transport Authority for the Greater Vienna region, which is about half of Austria regarding inhabitants, half of Austria regarding geographical coverage, and about 70% of all the public transport offer in the country, which is under our management. Before that, I used to work in Amsterdam at the Amsterdam Transport Authority for the Amsterdam region. So I've been around a little bit, and I've worked in different public transport authority organizations, which allows me to provide a bit of a comparison, I would say. I'm educated in Amsterdam and in Breda, another city in the Netherlands, in transportation and business. So let's talk EMTA. EMTA is the Association of Europe's Metropolitan Transport Authorities, and in that it unites these public transport authorities of Europe's metropolitan areas. So not the metropolitan area jurisdictions, but the specific bodies that are organizing the public transport services and networks. EMTA facilitates this collaboration, peer-to-peer learning and co-creation amongst its members, and represents the let's say common points of views and interests of metropolitan public transport at the EU level. And I would say that EMTA creates value through this very direct exchange amongst its members, who have extraordinarily different realities to work with regarding jurisdiction, regarding inhabitants, regarding socioeconomic outcomes of their regions. It's vastly different, but by having this very homogeneous membership of PTAs collaborating together, we can actually tackle the questions that they all have, and they can then translate it back into their local situations, and actually apply the solution that fits their regions best, because there's no one size fits all in this, not in Europe, not anywhere else in the world. The 34 public transport authorities currently united in EMTA are organizing the sustainable mobility backbone, that is public transport, for more than 110 million Europeans. So while we're a rather small group of small organizations, the average number of employees in our member PTAs is below 100, so between 80 and 100 people in each of these cities. But we're organizing, and we're having the responsibility for these public transport networks that are serving 110 million people daily, 24/7, 365. So EMTA is currently having a membership base of 33 full members and one associated member, which is the Stuttgart region. I'll come back to that in just a second. We cover 20 different countries, so we have metropolitan areas from 20 different countries, 17 of which are part of the European Union. And yes, the membership of EMTA is open to anyone around the world. In the case of the associate membership, the full membership is limited to PTAs located in Europe, and PTAs in the sense of that they have this planning and integrating jurisdiction across the different public transport modes. The region Stuttgart is an associated EMTA member because it only has this jurisdiction for the commuter railway services and not for the other transport services, but they still want to be part of our region, of our network, and they're most welcome to do so. Curiously, we did have Montreal in Canada as associated member for several years during the phase that they set up their integrated Metropolitan Transport Authority, which I believe now is quite successful. But of course, once this structure is in place, the look into other cities in North America might be of more use than across the pond. But now let's talk about the actual content. So let's talk public transport authorities or network coordinators, as you've mentioned it. And I just want to excuse myself a little bit for the bad lighting here, but I'm not a professional YouTuber or influencer, so I don't have a fancy ring light. I just need to do with my crappy old desk light here. So I hope that's okay for you all. So a PTA, a public transport authority, is, in our regard, a public body with legal responsibilities in the organization of public transport. That's as simple as it is, because if we make it a little bit more, let's say, sophisticated, then we would already rule out lots of these structures that are out there and could not integrate them into our network. Some of these regions have a mandate that even exceeds public transport, or as you call it in North America, transit, public transit. So the jurisdiction is sometimes enlarged to cover more mobility services, like the regulation of ride-hailing services or scooters or taxi in general. And some are even managing infrastructure. So let's say the regional road network or tunnels or bridges. So there's lots of diversity there. But the responsibility in the organization of public transport is what unites them, and their public, so their public sector status. If we now look at the functions of a PTA, then there's this beautiful list of terms, which are somewhat the commonalities of our members. They all started out some 30 years ago, not all of them, but let's say the big organizations started out some 30 years ago by becoming a fare integrator. So to have a first step of coordination across the landscape of different transport operators, city-owned, state-owned, sometimes private monopolists. And 25 years ago, they set up EMTA. So we just last week celebrated our 25th anniversary. So this integrated fare and integrated customer service is what set out this development of PTAs. And that has since then actually developed into something that is not just an orchestrator and integrator, but really becomes a planning authority and a procurement authority that actually takes the responsibility for the transport outcome and procures the necessary service on the market. And in order to have a bit of an overview of how these functions exist in different contexts, we can probably most easily put them across the different modes of transport that we usually see in Europe's regions. So we have metro, tram, regional buses, urban buses. The difference there is an urban bus usually operates within one municipality or one city, and a regional bus is an intercity service, so crossing several municipal borders. Same with like suburban and regional rail. So if we plot now the typical EMTA PTA over this matrix, then we see that the typical EMTA PTA is responsible for fare integration up to the suburban railway. So really those transport services that are of relevance for the daily mobility of the inhabitants of this, let's say, metro area. There is responsibilities in customer service, in the sales of tickets, and in the integration of service planning. So really from metro via tram, bus, regional bus to suburban rail, that's let's say the core of the metropolitan public transport system as it exists in many European regions. When it comes to the actual awarding of transport contracts, so the decision, the definition of contract terms and the procurement of the service, or the awarding of service to agencies, so to city-owned operators or to state-owned rail operators and bus operators, then this contract awarding usually stops with, or in the typical EMTA authority, stops with a bus, because everything that is more, let's say, on a cross-regional scale, which many rail services are, is usually organized on a state level or region level, and not in the metropolitan areas anymore. And interestingly, most PTAs in EMTA have some role with the infrastructure management of the metro and tram service, so localized rail-bound public transport services. Tram or light rail, I believe, is the term more usually used in North America. What is most curious here is usually what's not taken care of by the PTA. So we see that the usual EMTA PTA does not operate any transport service. As I said in the beginning, we're usually agencies of 80 to 100 employees. So there is no driving staff, there is no own buses, there is no trains, no train drivers in the ownership of these organizations, or in the employment on the payroll of these organizations. And I believe that's a major difference to North America, where the transit agencies, in a sense, are a mixture of what we have separated into transport authorities that have the responsibility for planning and the let's say overarching integration of service, and the actual operations on the ground. So the daily management of personnel and fleets, etc. We can play this game now a little bit by going through different EMTA regions and see what they're doing. So let's start.
Sorry,
yeah,
Thomas,
sorry.
can you just clarify, what does DRT stand for?
Oh yeah, DRT is demand responsive transport services. So where we talk of small vehicles, let's say 8 to 10 seaters, that are available on demand. So that is either by phone call or via an app, like an Uber pool service, which in many regions is now part of the public transport offer.
And would that include I don't know if you use the term paratransit in Europe, or if that is a distinct, essentially for people with who can't use conventional transit, who have disabilities.
Yeah.
Would that be under DRT? Okay.
There's a distinction there. So many EMTA regions do organize paratransit as you frame it, but I've not included it in this overview, because there is now a trend to actually develop demand responsive services, particularly in outer suburbs and in rural areas, to actually provide service where there's not been service yet to ordinary people. Most of those, or actually all of those, need to be accessible by wheelchair, for example, since there is quite stringent accessibility regulation. But I'm not looking at specialty services, let's say, at this point. So this is rather a transport service that is open and available to everyone. But indeed, there is this whole cosmos of paratransit services. Some of them volunteer run, some of them run by specific national agencies. So that's a whole different field to cover, I would say. So DRT, demand responsive transit, really open to the general public in this point. So let's have a look at Stockholm. Stockholm is developing a demand responsive transit service, and I believe they've visited the Bay Area to have a look at autonomous services, which is fascinating how they're developing in your region. But at this point, I've not included that because it's in the development stage. But if you look at all of the other services, then you see that all the way down to the operations. So they're not doing the operations like most other EMTA regions, but they're doing everything else. So for the customer, the Stockholm region, or their public transport brand SL, is the system that they use every day for their journeys. And quite curious, in Stockholm, the tender procedures is most fascinating, because the region of Stockholm is even tendering in competitive market tenders the operations of their trams, of their metros, of their buses. So regarding the collaboration between public and private, or public and commercial operations, Stockholm is a very interesting case study, simply because the region has decided that they will not have a region-owned or a city-owned operation anymore, but procure all of the operational aspects from operators on the market. So the metro system in Stockholm, for example, is now operated by the MTR, which is the transport provider of Hong Kong. So there's a competition taking place on how to actually put the operations on the ground. Going to a different area, Barcelona in Spain, there we have a lighter organization. So ATM, the transport authority in Barcelona, is actually not involved in the purchasing of, so in the procurement of service or in the organization of any operational aspects, it only does the integrated planning, so providing an overall regional plan on what services need to abide by, except for the tram. The tram is a very new public transport service in the region, and it's completely integrated into ATM's organization. So there they have the contractual responsibility. But for example, for the urban buses or the metro in Barcelona or the inter-region buses or the regional railway, these services are organized by completely different agencies. So the landscape of transit agencies or transport operators, as we would coin it over here, is incredibly complex in Barcelona. And the ATM is a very light organization that simply integrates all of that and makes it into one seamless service for the customer. Of course, all of that is historically grown. So the integration is a process that is still in the making. And with the tram being a very new service, you see that you're actually leapfrogging these historic developments and you're putting it into the regional oversight right away. So that's an interesting case study as well. Looking at Frankfurt, Frankfurt has the interesting aspect that they're actually organizing lots of the railway services. So they have the regional and suburban railway in their jurisdiction, but everything that has to do with urban public transport, so within the cities, metro, tram, they only play the integrating role with regard to service, customer service and fares. They're not responsible for any kind of operational aspects, for detailed timetables, etc. That's all taken care of by the different counties and by the different cities, who usually own their own transport operators or transport agencies. Then this is the situation here in Vienna. Quite similar. We're involved in all of the integration part, with the caveat that ticket sales are even taken care of by our transport operators, but every ticket that they sell is our integrated service ticket. And we are taking the responsibility for these demand responsive services in the region and for the regional buses. Everything else is organized by other agencies, by cities themselves. Like in the case of Vienna, the Wiener Linien transport operator is wholly owned by the city of Vienna, organizes their network completely by themselves, but then is integrated into our regional fare and has to abide by our very regional service planning. So that, for example, at night, you have connections when the frequencies are lower. So when you have lower frequencies, the integrated planning of the region needs to be abided by these local agencies so that you, even at midnight, have a proper connection throughout your region. So the lower the frequency, the more important is the integrated regional planning of services so that you can make your connections and you become an integrated region. And a last one, which is quite interesting, I would argue, is Transport for London. Simply because Transport for London is actually the only EMTA region that has an own operation. That's why I took them in here. And because they're pretty much so large that they do everything, up to the road management and infrastructure management. But in particular, the fact that they are operating their own metro service. So the London Underground is an operational department of Transport for London, which is a complete outlier. None of the EMTA transport authorities operates anything themselves, except for this one. Interestingly, everything else, Transport for London also procures on the market with competitive tender procedures. So now that we've looked into these functions and what a PTA actually does, we can have a quick look at PTA governance, in particular with the question of setting up such a structure. And there is probably two types of ownership for public transit agency or public transport authority, which is you either belong to one established jurisdiction or a group of jurisdictions. So one established jurisdiction might be the Île-de-France region in France, which entails Paris and the whole capital region. And by law in France, the regions are responsible for public transport. So there it is very clear that the ownership of the public transport authority is just with one organization, namely the region. And then the question comes up with, how do you then organize this specialty organization, this organization type that is responsible for public transport? Should it just be a department of this existing jurisdiction, so the transport department of the region, or should it be a specialized government agency, so with its own decision-making structure and councils and executive boards, in the sense of a very government agency type structure? Or should it be a limited company, which is owned by that one established jurisdiction, but is actually governed more like a private enterprise, with easier decision-making and more abiding by long-term planning than having daily decision-making taken care by political bodies? All of these exist within the EMTA network. So we also have groups of established jurisdictions, for example. An interesting case here could be Copenhagen, where you have the provinces around Copenhagen being the owners of the transport authority, just as well as all of the municipalities and the special administrative zone of Copenhagen itself. So a very diverse set of owners. And then comes the question, you can't be a department of any of these owners because the other owners want to have influence, obviously. So how do you set it up? Do you create a specialized government agency, or do you create a limited company? In the case of Copenhagen, they've gone for the specialized government agency with a very difficult, well, let's not say difficult because it's a democratic structure, so it's fantastic that we have it, but it's a complex democratic structure for decision-making in this agency. So now we can play the same game, look around Europe, how are they organized? Amsterdam, for example, is owned by the 17 municipalities, City of Amsterdam and 16 municipalities around. Is set up as a specialized government agency with the regional council, where all of these municipalities are represented, and a executive board where the three largest, so the transport mayors of the three largest regions, they take daily decisions and they have to defend the daily decisions towards the regional council, which is taking place, I think, 4 times a year. And then we can go to Oslo, where the two municipalities, Oslo municipality and the municipality of the province around Oslo city, have chosen to set up a limited company simply to be more agile. So they set clear goals for that company to achieve. They control this company in a board of supervisions, and they set these clear goals in the annual owners meeting. But the company itself has quite the possibility to develop daily business within their mandate without having to get democratic approval at every piece of every puzzle of the way. So with this, we have the big question of what the market of metropolitan public transport should actually be, because we can define it as, I believe, 3 different types of markets, which will produce completely different outcomes. And this is even a bit of a philosophical question, one could argue. So is metropolitan public transport a service of last resort for those unlucky few that cannot participate in society otherwise? So is it really this bus every 1 hour that collects the people that can otherwise not participate in society, where it will always be a discussion of, is it worth it? How much does it cost? It will not create revenue itself. Or is metropolitan public transport a system for heavy load services? So this is the typical commuter market, where you have very clear flows of transport, very clear transport demand into the city in the morning, out of the city in the afternoon. So serving these heavy loads, which would be in order to have congestion relief in these hours of the day where road congestion is the worst, but it will actually not deliver any kind of outcomes that have to do with the daily mobility of people. It will really be focused on these commuter journeys. Or should metropolitan public transport be this mobility backbone, where the majority of services are actually well served, the majority of journeys, pardon me, is actually well served with the metropolitan public transport system? that allows you to participate in society just as much as with a car or by cycling and walking, but does not require you to make this investment. And mobility actually becomes part of the public realm. So these are the three development paths that each region around the world can decide for themselves about. And yeah, with that food for thought, I hope we can jump into a bit of a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow, so much information and examples to think about. So I'm gonna start with a question that was submitted through the Q&A from Liz Bryson. How have the European PTAs overcome any issues with their staffing having adequate operational expertise to do the relevant centralized functions effectively? So if you know, in other words, if they don't do operations, most of these entities don't actually directly operate service. How do they have the qualifications and expertise to be essentially managing operations through contracts or through their other methods? Have there been challenges in that issue, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question, and that really comes to, let's say that this is a development path, and it is not something that you install right away and it works perfectly. I would argue that all of the EMTA regions, no matter how established they are still tweaking around their governance models, tweaking what type of contracts to use, to exert that oversight, but to also leave enough room for the daily operations to function smoothly. Quite interestingly, all of these functions in some way or another need to take place. So this idea of setting out, let's say, an overarching regional policy on how mobility should look like. If there's no regional policy for it, then there will be several local policies. So somebody is thinking about this, which means we're not creating, let's say, new work and new staff. We're just bundling functions that are already taking place. And by that, we're actually making sure that those agencies that are responsible for the daily operations can focus on the daily operations and have another part of the ecosystem taking care of these strategic goals and these, let's say, less evident matters that have influence on the customer experience and on the possibility of the network, but are not evident in your daily operation, in your local bubble, let's say. So in that regard, yes, it's a growth path. But if I look at Lisbon, which is our youngest member, it's an organization that's just 2 years old. So TML, the Metropolitan Transport Authority of Lisbon in Portugal. And if you look at what they've already achieved with an integrated fare, a complete new ticketing system, having tendered the regional buses, having created a single integrating fare and brand that people now associate with. And they've actually not produced many new products. For example, they had a product for companies to provide their employees, let's say a monthly pass, which is tax exempt for employer use. That ticket had existed, but nobody had used it. And now they've simply branded it Navgant Empresa, and it's going through the roof. So it's not all new work. It's really making the work that you're anyways doing at the spot where it has best impact, I would say. And I hope that satisfies.
Yeah, no, a clarification, customer research, there's a question also on like customer research. Is that typically one of the functions that centralize marketing and customer research? I don't think it was one of the categories of things. Is that something also that is typically done by the PTAs?
Marketing, yes and no. So there is some sense of overarching marketing. In some of our areas, the name of the PTA really is the public transport brand. Look at Oslo, but also look at Paris, where they've actually chosen that path quite recently. with everything now being branded in light blue and becoming Île-de-France Mobilité. So yes and no. In the status quo, all the train operators still want to have their own train brand. And we're lucky enough that most European member states or most European countries make their national rail operators accept the regional fare structure. So that's also not a given because the regions don't have any jurisdiction on national rail. But because of this kind of common understanding that an integrated fare and an integrated information provision is useful for daily mobility of citizens, even these national monopolists are kind of forced to participate in these fare systems, which are operated and managed by way smaller structures. I mean, here in Vienna, we're 100 people in our PTA, and ÖBB, our national railway operator, sits just on the other side of the city. We can see their tower from our offices, and they're with 15,000. So it's a complete, but we're the contract managers in a sense. We're the integrators. So they need to listen to us, and they don't want to sometimes. So that it's always good to play that card of, okay, this integration needs to happen for the customer. It's not because we want to do this or we are better than you. It's just you need to find a collaboration. So we always brand all of our transit agencies as partners within VOR. And already that notion kind of creates, yes, we can do our own stuff, but there is this sense of overarching integration that everybody kind of has to abide by, and everybody tends also to agree to abide by that.
Great. You talked a little bit about the evolution of different systems and that many of them started off as fare integrators or fare integration entities. At what point, I guess I'm wondering about the role of legislation in bringing about these structures. I'm sure it's different in every context, but do you have any general comments around are these entities generally enabled through a legislation? And at what point is it at the very beginning, or sort of do they start working together cooperatively and then ultimately formalized through legislation? Do you have any general, kind of?
I think that's so the last sentence you just said is what was the path. So there's been this incredible diversity in transport operations here in our region in Austria, but anywhere throughout Europe. And public transport is considered a service of general economic interest. So it has this kind of special status. It doesn't necessarily need to make money. It is exempt or need to make a profit in a sense of as other services like telecommunications is deemed to be commercialized in the EU, whereas public transport is understood that in our current economic situation where we have high subsidies for the car, implicit subsidies for car transport, there's no way that these regions or these networks could become profitable. And that understanding kind of led to the idea, okay, there is a function to let's say manage that market that would otherwise fail. And it had to deal with this idea that otherwise there would be monopolies. So the common European market actually led to breaking open of long-standing transport monopolies where simply bus operator A had always been the largest in a certain region, so it would always get the subsidy to operate in that region. And this whole European integration process over the last 30 years has actually led to a situation where, okay, if there is public money involved, but a private company is operating the service, then there needs to be a contract. And that has already kind of given the raison d'être for a public transport authority that manages this. Who gets to operate in which area, under what conditions, with what level of subsidy. But what I would argue is more important is actually this emancipation and this understanding that there are certain roles that should be taken care of by something that is under public oversight, and there's other aspects that can actually best be done under a somewhat commercial situation. So having a transport tender every 8 years makes sure that transport operators are actually optimizing their efficiencies as much as they can. And there's been a steep learning curve regarding social aspects, social dumping, conditions of drivers, etc. So there's been a steep learning curve there. But now I would argue that we understood how to frame contracts in a way that transport operators can actually look at their efficiencies and look at innovations that enable them to be more effective and efficient in their operations without having any kind of social dumping. I don't know if that term is used in the US as well, but it's in a sense, when you have a state-owned or a city-owned company that has a monopoly, then wages are usually quite high. And then there's the move towards a market-based situation, or let's say subsidies are distributed differently, that then this would be at the back of driving personnel, that they would have pay cuts rather than that the system gets more efficient. And there's been situations like that. There's big discussion in Paris where they're going to abolish their operator, the RATP, and they're putting everything out for tender. And driving personnel is now quite afraid of, okay, will we actually lose out on this? But I believe that European legislation and also transport authorities have become smarter and now understand that paying a cheaper cost per kilometer or hour of service is detrimental if this efficiency if that money gain comes from our driving personnel, which then leaves the market and leaves us with a driver shortage, which we have already. So we actually need to make sure that our driving personnel remains in the job and even attract new personnel.
Great. So in describing the different models, you had distinguished between a situation where a single jurisdiction oversees the whole region versus multiple jurisdictions. So we're definitely in the category here in the Bay Area of having multiple jurisdictions that, we don't have, the Bay Area is 9 different counties. So we would be looking at that path if we were to transpose your options on ourselves. And how do you, so an issue that comes up often here in thinking about governance for a multi-jurisdiction region is, how do you balance the vote share of urban and potentially higher transit ridership areas versus those that may have a greater population but lower transit ridership? Do you have any, I'm guessing that's also a challenge in Europe. Any conclusions to draw across your members in terms of how governance works in those situations to lead to good outcomes for everyone?
I mean, it certainly is a challenge. And speaking of the situation in Vienna, where you have a city of 2 million that is incredibly dense with very, very well-developed public transport services around the clock. And then you step 1 foot out of the city and you're in complete rural Austria. So there is this, let's say, tension is always there. Quite interestingly, the setup of an organization, like we're organized as a limited company, which actually enables us to be somewhat distant from this political, I know it's the wrong term, but I'm going to call it fuzz. It's important that we have these debates. But by creating an oversight body that has a clear mandate, as limited as it may be, but has a clear mandate and can fulfill that mandate with somewhat flexibility and is outcome oriented and let's say supervised based on certain outcome indicators, rather than having a political debate about each reduction or shift of service or network change or increase in the distance of bus stops. These are political aspects, that's absolutely true. But in order to develop a service and in order to develop the network so that it can actually attract new customers, you might need to depoliticize these developments a little bit. So I don't have an answer on how to perfectly balance this imbalance of rural versus city. The only thing I can tell is that both, let's say, region types or jurisdiction types have advantages by making the regional network more accessible and more useful for everybody. If people don't drive into the city, you have less congestion for city dwellers. If you have public transport services out into rural areas, you might be able to attract touristic customers from the city outside into the regions, which then cross-subsidizes local trips. So there would be a bus on a Saturday where there wasn't a bus on a Saturday, simply because the tourists from the city are actually, let's say, paying for that service to be run, which can then be used for local journeys in local jurisdictions as well. So it's these, let's say, overarching effects that might not necessarily be monetizable or put into figures in the first years of operation, but those are the things that are most interesting to see in the sense of development. And in particular, the newer EMTA regions, as I said, Lisbon is a fantastic example and a fantastic case study for that. And you said in your pitch in the beginning, Ian, that you have this point in time where it would make sense. So there's a sense of legal opportunity or funding opportunity. And that was exactly the case in Lisbon. They grabbed this opportunity. They set up a structure. In the beginning, it was a department of the metropolitan area. But very fast, they've actually created this own governance structure, which has a council that meets twice a year and a political board, which is appointed by this council to take the daily decisions. And it just plays out in a sense. If you're allowing those that represent in that council to not think in their region, but to think in the integrated network. So that's, they wear a different political hat in a sense. They're the representative of this integrated network, not the representative of the region where they originally came from. And that's maybe something like a development that needs some time as well to take place. But you need to start somewhere, I would argue.
I'll wrap up. We'll wrap up. We started a couple of minutes late, so we'll wrap up in the next minute or two. But just going back to the last comment, or one of the last comments you made, which is really that in setting up a regional structure, these are challenging issues, but ultimately all areas typically benefit. I'm paraphrasing what I think I heard you say. Both urban and rural and suburban areas have something to gain by working together and having a common connected network. And that I'm wondering, you have 34 members. We oftentimes hear folks say, who are unfamiliar with, how this might work. They think of the worst possible scenario of, well, if we introduce regional governance, we're going to lose riders and areas are going to have service cut, and we're going to, it's going to have bad equity outcomes. I mean, do you have any general, the fact that this is almost a universal setup across, Europe, I'm wondering, can you think of any examples where, it hasn't been the right solution, or where a region has, actually, gone back away from a more regional integration among your members, or just generally, like, does this ever come true? Like these fears around, that of prior to becoming part of a more integrated structure.
It's quite interesting. I mean, it's a brilliant question, and I would frame it from the viewpoint of a transit rider, or let's rather even enlarge it as a citizen of the region, where if I'm being told that there's this organization now, whatever structure it has, whatever governance it has, that is responsible for making sure that my transit will be better next year than it is today, and it actually succeeds in some ways, then this disintegration is impossible, because you're actually offering something to the customer. It's not just this generic voter. It's really by integrating schedulings, where you are ensured that your journey starts close to your home and actually ends very close to the destination where you want to go to, and the pain points in between, the interchanges are actually scheduled in the proper way. You have a fare that is ensuring that you can take the journey without being punished by making interchanges, but actually making the interchanges because it makes sense for you as a customer, but also for the operations of the network, where you don't have parallel services, but you're bundling services, etc. So it's really this taking responsibility. And if you have a body that does take responsibility, moving away from that is, I would argue, impossible. So I would not be aware of any organization that has failed in this development. On the contrary, what we see is that more and more municipalities want to be attached to it. We see that national governments are actually recognizing these kind of structures, so they get a complete new legal footing, and they get more mandate and more demands to become more digitally averse, create mobility as a service situations, integrate with non-public transport modes. So this responsibility for making sure that a journey can take place, that's not something that a local agency can do. They can probably do it within their jurisdiction, but they cannot do it for this region, and they cannot unlock this regional potential by looking within their own operations. They should look at their own operations. That's what they're there for. But that's why you need this other level on top. And it's not a competition, not at all. It's really enabling what should take place at a larger scale, so that those at the local level can actually focus on their operations and get their operations even more efficient and better for the customer.
Okay, well, thank you so much for staying with us so late. I believe it's past 9 p.m. where you are. Thanks to everyone who joined us this evening and for all the great questions. We'll be posting this online, and thank you so much. We'll be hope to hold more events like this, and I hope our region considers maybe becoming an EMTA member, an associate member, to tap into this incredible knowledge network that exists, that I think is so relevant to the challenges that we're going through right now. And I also am going to follow up with the folks at Lisbon. It sounds like they had some really recent success that would be helpful to share with us. So bye, everyone, and thank you, Thomas.
You're very, very welcome. Have a good day and good night from Vienna.